The scent hit me before the elevator doors even slid shut. Sandalwood and rain. A specific, heavy fragrance that had no business existing in the sterile, climate-controlled air of a corporate law firm. My pen froze mid-signature, the ink bleeding a tiny, dark pool onto the document. My breath caught, sharp and sudden, high in my throat. It wasn't just a sensory memory. It was a warning. Lydia wasn't just the woman who had walked out of my apartment 3 years ago with my heart packed into a cardboard box. Today, she was opposing counsel on the biggest merger of my career. And I knew, with terrifying clarity, that professional survival was about to clash with a wound that had never actually healed. I had built a life designed specifically to keep things like this out. My world was a carefully curated architecture of control, measured in 6-minute billable increments and the clean, unforgiving lines of a 40-story view. I lived in a fortress of glass and steel, where emotions were liabilities and silence was a negotiating tactic. Here, in the hushed corridors of the firm, the air was always cool, recycled, and impersonal. The rhythmic cadence of keyboards and the soft white noise hum of the HVAC system were the only soundtrack I allowed. It was a safe existence. Precise. Lonely, perhaps, if you looked too closely at the empty spaces in my calendar, or the lack of photographs on my desk, but it was safe. It was mine. Then the whispers started, drifting over the cubicle walls like smoke. The associates were buzzing about the shark from the rival firm, the specialist brought in to handle a hostile takeover that was already bleeding us dry. They talked about her reputation, ruthless, efficient, unflinching. They traded war stories they'd heard secondhand, painting her as a cold-blooded litigator who could dismantle a witness with a single question. I listened to them describe her like she was a force of nature, a storm coming to wreck our carefully laid plans. They didn't know that I knew exactly how that storm felt when it was quiet. They didn't know that the shark slept on the left side of the bed, stole the covers, and hummed off-key when she made coffee in the morning. To them, she was a threat to the bottom line. To me, she was the only variable I hadn't accounted for in my 5-year plan. I retreated to my office, closing the frosted glass door against the noise, needing the illusion of privacy. I needed to prepare, not just for the legal battle. I knew the statutes, the precedents, the loopholes better than anyone, but for the physical reality of her presence. I treated the next hour like a complex surgical procedure. I had to excise the memory of her hands, the ghost of her voice, the way she used to look at me when the argument stopped and the softness began. I had to sever the feeling from the function. I told myself this was just business, a merger, a contract, a series of clauses to be debated, redlined, and signed. But my body wasn't listening to the logic I was trying to force-feed it. I stood in front of the mirror on the back of my door, smoothing a non-existent crease in my blazer, obsessing over the details. My reflection looked composed, the senior partner, the closer, the woman who didn't lose. But beneath the tailored wool and the silk blouse, my pulse was hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. I adjusted my collar, the fabric cool against my flushed skin. I checked my hands. There was a tremor there, faint but undeniable, a betrayal of the nerves I claimed not to have. I pressed my palms flat against the cold mahogany desk, grounding myself, forcing the shaking to stop through sheer will. The leather chair, the stack of files, the view of the city, these were my anchors. I held onto them tight. I wasn't afraid of losing the deal. I was afraid of what would happen when the professional mask slipped. I was afraid that the carefully constructed walls of my life were made of paper, and she was the match. The phone on my desk blinked, the silent signal. It was time. I took a breath that didn't quite fill my lungs, picked up the file that felt heavy as lead, and walked toward the inevitable. The hallway seemed longer than usual, the fluorescent lights too bright, exposing everything. Then, ahead of me, the double doors to the main conference room began to open, the sound of the latch clicking echoing like a gunshot in the quiet. Safety was over. The architecture of control was about to be tested. The double doors swung inward, and Lydia walked into the room. The visual impact was a physical blow, a sudden loss of cabin pressure that left my ears popping. She hadn't changed. That was the first cruel realization. The sharp cut of her blazer, a severe midnight blue that she always favored because it made her eyes look dangerous, was exactly as I remembered. Her stride was the same, too. Purposeful, rhythmic, the click of her heels on the parquet floor sounding out a warning code I was the only one trained to decipher. She didn't look around the room. She didn't need to scan for threats because she was the threat. She walked straight to the head of the opposing table, dropped her leather portfolio with a heavy thud that vibrated through the wood, and finally, slowly, lifted her eyes to mine. The air in the room seemed to vanish, sucked out by the sudden vacuum of our proximity. My associates were standing, offering polite nods, smoothing ties, performing the ritual dance of corporate greeting. I forced my legs to straighten, engaging muscles that felt like water, forcing my body to mimic their ease. I extended my hand. It was the standard maneuver, the professional courtesy required by the unwritten laws of the firm. But when her fingers brushed mine, the reaction was chemical. It wasn't a polite shake, it was a collision. Her skin was cool, dry, but the current that shot up my arm was hot enough to burn. The static charge defied the neutral, sterile distinctness of a business greeting. It felt like sticking a fork into a socket while standing in a puddle of gasoline. "Counsel," she said. Her voice was steady, stripped of any inflection, a perfect monotone of professional indifference. "Lydia," I replied, the name tasting like ash and sugar on my tongue. I didn't add the title. I couldn't. We sat. The table was 12 feet of polished mahogany, a vast, shiny sea designed to keep warring parties apart, but it felt like inches. She opened her portfolio, and that's when I saw it. A thin, jagged white line running across the back of her left hand, just above the knuckles. A scar. It was new. It was a piece of history I didn't have the clearance to access. How had she gotten it? A kitchen accident? A fall? A fight? The realization that she had lived a whole life, accumulated wounds and stories in the 3 years since she left my hallway, settled in my stomach like a stone. I watched her pick up her pen, a heavy silver fountain pen, not the cheap ballpoints the firm provided. She held it differently now, choking up higher on the barrel, her grip tighter, more defensive. It was a tiny detail, microscopic really, but to a lover, it was a headline. It screamed that she was guarding herself, even here, even now. The meeting commenced. The junior associates began reading the opening statements, their voices droning on about asset valuation, liability caps, and intellectual property rights. The language was dry, arid, the dust of commerce settling over us. But underneath the talk of synergies and acquisitions, a different conversation was happening. Every time she challenged a clause, leaning forward, her eyes locking onto mine, I felt the phantom weight of her body against me. When she dismissed a valuation with a wave of her hand, I remembered how that same hand felt tangled in my hair. The contrast was disorienting. We were discussing millions of dollars in assets, but the currency passing between us was entirely emotional. Regret, desire, anger, want. The dry language of the contract clashed violently with the wet, heavy heat of memory. She was brilliant, of course. I hated that I still admired it. She dismantled my associate's argument about the subsidiary holdings with a few precise sentences, her logic a scalpel that cut clean to the bone. She used silence as a weapon, letting a pause stretch out until the other side rushed to fill it with a concession. I knew that trick. I had seen her use it in our kitchen at 2 a.m. when we were arguing about whose career mattered more. She would just wait, watching me unravel, until I gave her what she wanted just to break the tension. Now she was doing it for a client, but the target felt personal. She looked at me across the table, eyebrows raised slightly, daring me to interrupt, daring me to break the silence she had built. Time warped. The hour scheduled for the preliminary review stretched and distorted. I was hyper-aware of her breathing, the slight rise and fall of that blue blazer. I caught the scent of her again, sandalwood, rain, and something else, something sharper, like anxiety masked by expensive soap. Eventually, the senior partner on her side checked his watch and signaled the end of the round. Papers were shuffled, laptops snapped shut. The meeting adjourned, voices chattering about lunch orders and parking validation. But the air between Lydia and me remained heavy, suspended, a storm cloud waiting to break. In the codified language of high-stakes litigation, discovery is a polite term for an invasion. It is the phase where you demand the opposing side open their veins and bleed data, where you sift through thousands of emails, financial records, and internal memos, looking for the smoking gun that will kill their leverage. We spent 3 days in that windowless conference room, buried under a landslide of bankers' boxes and hard drives, engaging in this forensic strip search of the merger targets. But for me, the term took on a heavier, sharper double meaning. I wasn't just discovering the hidden liabilities of a tech conglomerate. I was discovering who Lydia had become in the 1,000 days since we last spoke. It was a slow, agonizing excavation. I learned that she now needed reading glasses for the fine print, sleek, tortoiseshell frames that she perched on the end of her nose, a gesture that made her look devastatingly academic. I learned she had quit coffee and switched to herbal tea, a jagged little change that felt like a betrayal of our caffeine-fueled law school nights. And I learned that she no longer tapped her pen when she was impatient. Now, she simply went still, a predator waiting for the prey to flinch. I was supposed to be the confident guide for my team, the senior partner steering the ship. But my internal map was being rewritten in real time. Every new detail about her was a landmark I didn't recognize, forcing me to navigate a terrain that felt simultaneously foreign and terrifyingly familiar. The tension in the room wasn't static. It was a living thing that moved between us, spiking during the most mundane interactions. On the third afternoon, we were arguing over a warranty clause in the intellectual property addendum. The air conditioning had been fighting a losing battle against the heat of 12 bodies and running laptops, leaving the room stifling and close. I needed to pass her the revised redline document, a physical copy, because Lydia insisted on hard paper for final reviews. I stood up, the movement stiff, and slid the file across the mahogany. She reached for it at the exact moment I let go. It shouldn't have mattered. It was friction, physics, skin against skin. But when the side of her index finger brushed against my thumb, the sensation was immediate and violent. It wasn't a spark, it was a shock, a sudden awareness of heat that made the rest of the room dissolve into gray noise. I felt the temperature of her skin, fever warm, dry, alive. And for a split second, my hand convulsed, wanting to grab hers, to lace our fingers together and anchor myself against the vertigo. I pulled back as if I'd touched a hot stove, the file sliding an extra inch and hitting her water glass with a soft clink. Lydia didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She just held her hand there for a beat too long, hovering over the paper, her eyes fixed on the document, but her focus clearly elsewhere. The silence that followed was loud, filled with the echo of that accidental intimacy. She used that silence, too. It had always been her most effective weapon in arguments, but now she had weaponized it for the client. When my junior associate, a bright but nervous kid named Marcus, stumbled through an explanation of the indemnity caps, Lydia didn't interrupt. She didn't attack. She just waited. She sat back in her chair, steepled her fingers, a new habit, and let the silence stretch out until it became unbearable. It was a power move, designed to make the other side babble and concede just to fill the void. I watched her do it, recognizing the cadence of it. It was the same silence she used to leave in the kitchen after a fight, the same heavy pause that used to make me apologize just to hear her voice again. Now, I had to kick Marcus under the table to stop him from negotiating against himself, stepping in to break her spell with a sharp, "Our position stands, counsel." But even when we weren't speaking, the conversation continued. I would catch her looking. It happened in the periphery, in the blur of movement while I was checking emails or whispering instructions to my team. I would feel the weight of her gaze on the side of my face, heavy and physical. When I turned to meet it, she wouldn't look away immediately. That was the killer. She would hold my eyes, unflinching, for a second that stretched into an eternity, her expression unreadable, but her intensity undeniable. It wasn't a professional assessment. She wasn't looking at opposing counsel. She was looking at me. Then, with a slow, deliberate blink, she would turn back to her notes, leaving me breathless and disoriented, wondering if I was imagining the heat or if we were both slowly suffocating in it. By 6 p.m., the atmosphere shifted. The senior partners, men with golf handicaps to maintain and families to ignore, began their exodus. They checked their expensive watches, made performative noises about hard stops and dinner commitments, and filed out one by one. The room emptied until it was just the associates, young, hungry, and oblivious, and us. The air grew thinner, sharper. The safety of the crowd was gone. The buffer of corporate hierarchy had evaporated, leaving the two leads to grind out the details in the darkening room. As the door clicked shut behind the last partner, the dynamic in the room changed instantly. The professional armor felt thinner, the distance across the table shorter. We were no longer performing for an audience. We were just two women with a history of wreckage, trapped in a glass box as the sun went down, pretending that the only thing at stake was a merger. The city outside was a smear of neon and rain against the glass, a distant, blurry galaxy that felt 1,000,000 miles away from the 42nd floor. Inside, the building had settled into its nocturnal rhythm. The aggressive, caffeine-fueled hum of the day was gone, replaced by the low, rhythmic thrum of the HVAC system, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to get louder as the hours ticked past 10. The associates had finally been dismissed, sent home with taxi vouchers and dark circles under their eyes, leaving just the two of us in the conference room. It felt vast and cavernous now, the empty leather chairs like spectators who had gotten bored and left, abandoning us to the arena. The fluorescent lights had dimmed to a security setting, casting long, sharp shadows that stretched across the polished mahogany like accusing fingers. We had abandoned the adversarial seating arrangement hours ago. It wasn't a conscious decision, or maybe it was, but the geography of the table had shifted. We were no longer captains of opposing ships shouting across the water. We were two mechanics trying to fix an engine before it exploded. I had moved to the side of the table to parse through a stack of environmental compliance reports, and Lydia had drifted, gravitated, until she was standing right beside me, leaning over the same spread of documents. The scent was overwhelming now. Without the distraction of other bodies, the smell of sandalwood and rain filled the space between us. It was a sensory trigger that bypassed my brain and went straight to my chest, seizing my lungs. It smelled like Sunday mornings. It smelled like the pillow next to mine. It smelled like the life I thought I had successfully evicted. "We need to eat," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the weary authority of someone who knew my blood sugar crashed at 10 p.m. "Ty?" I asked, without looking up from the file, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. "Obviously. The place on 4th? They closed last year. There's a new spot on 9th. I pulled out my phone, the screen glowing bright in the dim room. "Pad key mao for you?" "No onions," she said, her eyes still scanning the page, her finger tracing a line of text. "Extra spice," I added, tapping the screen. "And tell them if they skimp on the basil, I will litigate," she murmured. I froze for a second. It was a joke. A small, dry, familiar joke. And for a terrifying moment, the glass walls of the firm dissolved. We weren't opposing counsel. We were just us, ordering dinner on a Tuesday, navigating the intimate shorthand of two people who had memorized each other's hungers. I ordered the food, my thumb hovering over the confirm button for a second too long, shaking slightly. The domesticity of it, the ease with which I knew her order, the way she knew I knew, felt more dangerous than any contract clause we had argued over that day. It was a breach of the containment field I had built around my memories. We ate in the break room, a sterile white box that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and sanitizer. We sat on the cheap plastic chairs, knees angled away from each other, eating out of cardboard cartons. The silence was different now. It wasn't the weaponized silence of the boardroom. It was the heavy, loaded silence of the aftermath. "You look tired," she said. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation, delivered with a softness that made my defenses spike. "It's a merger, Lydia. Everyone looks tired." "No," she said, putting her fork down. "I mean, you look worn down. Is this—" She gestured vaguely at the building, the suit, the life. "Is this enough for you?" The question hung in the air, sharp and bright. "Are you happy?" That was what she was really asking. "I'm successful," I deflected, stabbing a piece of tofu with unnecessary force. "I'm a partner. I have the corner office. I won." "That's not what I asked." I looked at her then. Really looked at her. Her guard was down, just an inch. Her eyes were searching mine, looking for the woman she used to know beneath the layers of billable hours and corporate armor. "I'm fine, Lydia. I'm exactly where I planned to be." "Plans change," she whispered, her voice low. "People change." We went back to the conference room, the air between us charged with the ghost of that unfinished conversation. We were leaning over the master agreement again, shoulder to shoulder. I could hear her breathing. It was a slow, steady rhythm, a soft exhale through her nose every time she finished reading a paragraph. I found my own breath sinking to it, an involuntary physiological response to her proximity. In, out. In, out. We were a single organism again, breathing the same recycled air. She reached across me to grab a red pen. Her arm brushed against my shoulder, warm, solid, real. I flinched, a reflex born of too much tension, and my elbow knocked into the stack of case files. The tower of paper toppled, sliding across the polished wood in a chaotic avalanche of white. "Shit," I hissed, lunging to catch them. She moved at the same time. Our hands collided in the mess of papers. We both froze. We were bent over the table, faces inches apart, hands tangled in the wreckage of the merger. I could feel the heat radiating off her. I could count the eyelashes on her left eyelid. The distance was gone. The professional barrier had collapsed under the weight of a few hundred pages of legal briefs. The silence coiled tight, snapping around us like a trap, leaving us staring at each other, waiting for the other to break. We gathered the scattered papers in a silence that felt frantic, a hasty retreat from the sudden, terrifying intimacy of the conference room. I shoved files into my bag without checking the order, my hands still tingling from the accidental collision with hers. We needed to leave. The building was closing in on us, the glass walls no longer feeling like windows to the world, but like the sides of a specimen jar. We walked to the elevator bank in the hallway, the sound of our heels on the marble floor echoing out of sync. I pressed the call button, tapping it twice, an impulsive, useless gesture to speed up the machinery. I needed an exit. I needed air that didn't taste like her perfume and my own regret. When the elevator finally arrived, the doors slid open with a smooth, hydraulic hiss. We stepped inside, and the doors closed, sealing us into a 6x6 vertical coffin of brushed steel and mirrored surfaces. If the conference room had been a battlefield, this was a pressure chamber. The air here was different, still recycled and thick. The silence wasn't empty. It was coiled, a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I stared at the digital display, watching the floor numbers light up in descending order. 40, 39, 38. The descent was smooth, but my stomach dropped with a vertigo that had nothing to do with gravity. Lydia didn't look at the numbers. In the reflection of the polished steel doors, I saw her watching me. We were a match set, a study in corporate symmetry. Same sharp tailoring, same exhaustion, same hunger masked as professional drive. "We were good at this, weren't we?" she said softly. Her voice was low, vibrating in the small space, cutting through the mechanical hum of the cables. I didn't pretend not to understand. I kept my eyes on the numbers. "Mergers?" "Arguing," she corrected, shifting her stance. "The friction, the push and pull. We were always best when the stakes were impossible." I looked at her then, unable to avoid the direct challenge. "We were good at the fighting, Lydia. It was the piece we couldn't figure out. It was the truth, and it landed between us like a heavy stone. That was the tragedy of our history. We were both creatures of ambition, fueled by adrenaline and the need to win. We fed off the conflict, the intellectual sparring, the high-stakes negotiation of a relationship. But when the work was done, when the apartment was quiet and the armor came off, we didn't know how to just be. The ambition that had made us a power couple was the exact thing that tore the foundation apart. I remembered the night she left. It wasn't a screaming match. It was a negotiation that hit an impasse. She wanted a partnership in London. I wanted the tenure track here. Neither of us would concede. We treated our love like a contract, and when the terms were no longer favorable, we dissolved the partnership. And now that same ambition had dragged us back into the same orbit. The irony was suffocating. The very drive that had made it impossible to stay together was the only reason we were standing shoulder to shoulder in this descending box, fighting for opposite sides of a deal that meant everything and nothing. The elevator shuddered slightly as it passed the 20th floor, a minor mechanical hiccup that felt seismic in the quiet. Lydia swayed, her balance shifting on her heels. She didn't grab the rail. She leaned toward me. It was subtle, maybe unintentional, the physics of a moving object, but the distance between us vanished. Her arm brushed against mine, wool against wool, but beneath the fabric, I could feel the heat of her arm. It was a magnetic pull, a physical law I couldn't rewrite. My breath hitched, catching high in my throat. I should have stepped away. There was room in the corner. I could have retreated to the safety of the far wall, but I didn't. I stayed rooted to the spot, my body betraying my better judgment. I wanted the contact. I wanted the friction. I wanted to lean back into the fire that had burned me down 3 years ago. She turned her head, her profile sharp against the steel. Her eyes caught mine, dark and dilated in the dim light. Her lips parted slightly, a breath escaping that sounded like my name. The air between us crackled, charged with 3 years of unsaid words and unspent desire. The descent felt endless, a free-fall in slow motion. I watched her gaze drop to my mouth, then flick back up to my eyes. The question was there, unspoken but screaming. "Do you still feel it?" My hand twitched at my side, the urge to reach out, to grab her lapel, to pull her across the invisible line, terrifyingly strong. "Lydia," I breathed. A warning or an invitation. I didn't know which. She leaned in closer. The scent of sandalwood was everywhere now, drowning out the metallic smell of the shaft. The world outside this box didn't exist. There was no merger, no firm, no past. Just the heat of her skin and the terrifying possibility of the present. Then, the machine intervened. Ding! The sound was sharp, cheerful, and completely incongruous with the atmosphere in the car. The doors slid open, revealing the harsh, bright expanse of the lobby. The spell shattered instantly. The cold air of the atrium rushed in, sweeping away the heavy, intimate fog we had generated. Lydia blinked, the vulnerability vanishing behind her professional mask in a split second. She stepped back, adjusting her bag, reclaiming her space. "See you tomorrow, Council," she said, her voice back to that cool monotone, walking out into the night without looking back. I stood in the open elevator for a beat too long, shivering in the sudden, brutal cold. The storm didn't just arrive, it besieged the city. By the following evening, the sky had turned a bruised, violent purple, and the rain was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the 42nd floor with a force that felt personal. It wasn't just weather. It was a containment field. The transit authority had suspended the trains. The streets below were gridlocked rivers of red taillights, and the building management had issued a shelter-in-place advisory until the worst of the cell passed. The office, usually a fortress of commerce, suddenly felt less like a seat of power and more like a cage suspended in the gray, turbulent air. We were the last two left. Again. The symmetry of it would have been laughable if it didn't feel so inevitable. We had retreated to my office when the main lights in the conference room flickered and died, victims of a grid surge that left the building running on emergency power. The hum of the HVAC system, that constant rhythmic heartbeat of the firm, cut out, leaving behind a silence that was heavy and thick. The air grew still, losing its recycled chill, warming slowly with the heat of our bodies and the humidity pressing against the glass. In the dim light of my office, illuminated only by the glow of a single desk lamp and the flashes of lightning that illuminated the skyline, the corporate veneer finally cracked. Lydia was standing by the window, watching the water streak down the glass, distorting the world outside into an impressionist smear of gray and black. She looked small against the backdrop of the storm. The shark, the closer, the woman who terrified junior associates with a raised eyebrow, was gone. In her place was just Lydia. She raised a hand to her forehead, rubbing her temples in slow, circular motions, her eyes squeezed shut. It was a gesture of profound exhaustion, a crack in the porcelain mask she had been wearing for 4 days straight. She let out a breath, a long, shaky exhale that sounded like a surrender. "I hate storms," she whispered, not to me, but to the glass. "I know," I said softly. "You hate things you can't negotiate with." She didn't argue. She didn't snap back with a witty retort or a legal precedent. She just nodded, a jerky, fragile movement, and turned away from the window. She walked to the leather sofa in the corner of my office and sank into it, not with her usual grace, but with the heavy gravity of someone whose bones were tired. She leaned her head back, exposing the long line of her throat, and I felt a pang of familiarity so sharp it almost doubled me over. I knew that throat. I knew the pulse that beat there. I knew the exact weight of the headache that was currently drilling behind her eyes. I stepped into the role that had been mine for years before it was stripped away. I wasn't opposing counsel anymore. I was the person who knew where she kept the ibuprofen. I poured a glass of water from the pitcher on my desk, the ice clinking softly in the quiet room, a domestic sound that felt deafening in a workspace designed for mergers and acquisitions. I walked over to her, moving slowly, telegraphing my approach so I wouldn't startle her. "Here," I said, holding out the glass. She opened her eyes. They were glassy, rimmed with red, stripped of their usual predatory focus. She reached for the water. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice rough. I watched her hand as she took the glass. That was the detail that broke me. Her hand, usually so steady, usually wielding a pen like a weapon, was shaking. It was a fine, high-frequency tremor, the kind that comes from too much caffeine, too little sleep, and the crushing weight of holding up a sky that wants to fall. The condensation on the cold glass slicked her fingers, and I saw a drop of water trace the line of that new scar on her knuckle. The urge to reach out was physical, a magnetic pull in the center of my chest. I wanted to wrap my hands around hers, to steady the tremor, to be the anchor she clearly needed. I wanted to kneel in front of her, pull her polished shoes off, and rub the tension out of her arches like I used to on Friday nights after a trial. The professional distance I had fought so hard to maintain was dissolving in the dim light. The anger I had been nursing for 3 years, the resentment over the breakup, the bitterness about the career choices, the fury at seeing her across the negotiation table. It all evaporated. It just vanished, leaving no ash, no smoke. And in its place, filling the vacuum where the anger used to be, was a terrifying amount of want. It wasn't a nostalgic longing. It was an immediate, visceral need. I looked at her, broken and beautiful in the half-light, and I didn't want to win the merger. I just wanted to keep the storm out. I wanted to be the shelter. The realization hit me with the force of the thunder rattling the windows. I was still in love with her. And that was more dangerous than any poison pill clause she could ever write. The return of the building's power grid was a violent intrusion. The overhead fluorescents flickered once, twice, and then slammed on with a blinding, sterile whiteness that bleached the shadows and the intimacy right out of the room. The hum of the HVAC system roared back to life, drowning out the quiet rhythm of our breathing. In an instant, the shelter we had built against the storm evaporated. Lydia stiffened, the vulnerability vanishing from her posture as if she'd been caught naked. She stood up abruptly, smoothing her skirt, reassembling her armor piece by piece. She walked back to the table, picked up her pen, and the wall was back up. We weren't two women sharing water in the dark anymore. We were opposing counsel, and the truce was over. We worked through the night, fueled by a jagged, nervous energy that felt less like productivity and more like panic. We were running from what had happened on the sofa. And then, at 4 a.m., buried in the addendums of the shareholder agreement, I found it. A poison pill. A dead hand provision that would allow her client to dilute the stock and tank the entire merger if a single minor revenue target was missed in the first quarter. It wasn't just a safeguard. It was a kill switch. It was a guarantee that at the first sign of trouble, the whole thing would burn. I stared at the paragraph, the legal jargon blurring into a single accusatory sentence. It was so perfectly her. It was the architectural blueprint of our breakup, translated into corporate law. "You inserted a termination trigger," I said, my voice deadly quiet. Lydia didn't look up from her laptop. "It's a standard asset protection clause. Given the volatility of your client's Q3 earnings, it's necessary diligence." "It's not diligence, Lydia. It's an eject button." I slammed the file shut, the sound cracking like a whip in the empty room. "You're setting this up to fail." She finally looked at me, her eyes cool and defiant. "I am setting it up to survive a worst-case scenario. Some of us plan for the fallout. Some of us don't live in a fantasy where everything works out just because we want it to." The subtext hit me in the chest. We weren't talking about the merger. We never were. "Is that what you think?" I stood up, the chair scraping screechingly against the floor. "That I was living in a fantasy? Or were you just too terrified to stay in the reality?" "I was realistic," she snapped, standing up to meet me. "I knew the metrics. I knew the projections. We were incompatible assets. I just executed the dissolution before the bankruptcy." "You didn't dissolve it," I countered, my voice rising, losing the professional cadence I had practiced. "You breached. You walked out because you can't handle a contract you can't control. You need an exit strategy for everything. You need a door to run out of the second things get messy." "I need security," she shouted back, the facade fully cracking now. "I need to know that if the bottom falls out, I'm not going to be buried in the rubble. You throw yourself into things without looking at the risk. You sign the deal without reading the fine print because you think passion is a substitute for stability. And you think fear is a substitute for wisdom," I shot back. We were moving toward each other now, drawn by the gravity of the argument. The mahogany table was no longer a barrier. We were circling the edge of it, closing the distance. "It's not fear," she hissed, her face inches from mine. "It's survival." "It's cowardice," I said. the word landing soft and heavy between us. "You wrote this clause because you don't trust the partnership. You don't trust the build. You only trust the escape." Lydia flinched as if I'd slapped her. Her chest was heaving, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps that mirrored my own. We were standing toe-to-toe now, the physical space between us obliterated. I could see the gold flecks in her furious eyes. I could smell the sandalwood, heated now by the adrenaline spiking in her blood. The air around us was radioactive. It was the same energy as the elevator, but sharper, dangerous. It was the heat of a star collapsing. "Tell me," I challenged, my voice dropping to a rough whisper, holding her gaze, unflinching. "Tell me this is about the client. Look me in the eye and tell me this clause is about the stock price." She opened her mouth to argue, to cite a statute, to defend the indefensible. But the words died in her throat. She looked at me, really looked at me, and the anger in her eyes warred with a terrified, desperate longing. She didn't back down. She didn't retreat. She stood her ground, shaking with the force of everything she wasn't saying. "You know why I did it," she breathed, the admission hanging suspended in the electrified air. The shout had died, leaving a silence that was louder than the storm had ever been. We were standing on the precipice, the contract forgotten, the merger irrelevant. There was only the terrifying truth of us, stripped bare under the harsh office lights, waiting to see who would jump first. The aftermath of the argument wasn't peace. It was a ceasefire born of sheer exhaustion. We had channeled that terrified, explosive energy back into the paperwork, finishing the red lines with a grim, silent efficiency that felt less like legal work and more like burying a body. The deal was signed. The merger was secure. The war, on paper at least, was over. The adrenaline that had sustained us through the shouting match and the final negotiations crashed all at once, leaving behind a hollow, ringing silence that felt louder than the storm outside. The office was empty again, stripped of the purpose that had kept us in the same room for 12 hours. The fluorescent lights hummed, a flat, indifferent sound that highlighted the sudden lack of motion. I sat at the head of the table, watching Lydia. She was standing by her chair, packing up her life. It was a terrifyingly familiar sight. She moved with a surgical precision, sliding the executed contracts into her leather portfolio, capping her fountain pen, aligning the edges of her notepad. She was erasing herself from the room, scrubbing the evidence of her presence, just as she had done 3 years ago in our hallway. She reached for the brass latches of her briefcase. Snap, snap. The sound was deafening. It was a gunshot in the quiet room, a final, percussive note that signaled the end. It was the exact sound of the door closing behind her that morning in November. It triggered a physical recoil in me, a sudden, sharp panic that had nothing to do with the firm and everything to do with the woman who was about to walk out of it. She picked up the case, the leather creaking slightly under the weight of the files, and the weight of everything we hadn't said. She turned toward the door, her eyes fixed on the exit sign, refusing to look at me. She was executing the exit strategy. She was surviving by leaving. I couldn't let the pattern repeat. The realization hit me with the clarity of the morning light beginning to bleed through the blinds. If she walked out that door now, with the poison pill of our history still unresolved, she would never come back. We would become just another anecdote, two partners who couldn't make the merger work. I moved before I made the conscious decision to do it. I stood up, the motion sharp enough to knock my chair back, and walked to the office door. I didn't run, but I moved with a cadence that refused to be ignored. I reached the threshold a second before she did. I didn't lock it. I didn't raise my hand to stop her. I just leaned back against the frame, blocking the exit not with force, but with presence. I made myself the obstacle she had to acknowledge. Lydia stopped 3 feet away. She gripped the handle of her briefcase until her knuckles turned white like the scar on her hand. She finally looked up, and the exhaustion in her eyes was a physical weight. "Move," she said. Her voice was brittle, holding on to professionalism by a thread. "No," I said. It was quiet, calm, terrifyingly honest. "The deal is done. The papers are signed. We have nothing left to discuss." "The merger is done," I corrected. "We aren't." She flinched, shifting her weight, looking for a way around me, looking for the loophole. "I have a flight, Counsel. I have a life to get back to." "Do you?" I asked, pushing off the doorframe just enough to invade her personal space. "Because for the last 4 days, you haven't been acting like someone who wants to leave. You've been acting like someone waiting to be asked to stay." "That is," she started, the denial rising automatically. "Don't," I cut her off. "Don't give me the closing argument. Don't give me the prepared statement. Just tell me the truth." The air between us coiled tight again, that familiar, dangerous tension that had been humming under the floorboards all week. "You're running because you're scared," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "You're running because the second we stopped fighting about the contract, you realized the anger was the only thing protecting you from the want." Lydia stared at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The mask was gone. The shark was gone. "I'm not running," she lied, but her voice shook. "Then put the bag down," I challenged. "If this is just business, if I'm just opposing counsel, then walk past me. But if you feel what I feel, if you feel that tension coiling in your stomach every time I look at you, then put the bag down." I waited. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. I saw the war behind her eyes, the instinct to survive battling the instinct to connect. I saw her look at the door, then at me, then at the space between us. "It's too late," she whispered, the words sounding like a plea. "It's only too late if you leave," I said. Her grip on the handle loosened. Her shoulders dropped. The fight went out of her, replaced by something softer, something raw. She exhaled, a long, broken sound, and opened her hand. The briefcase hit the floor with a heavy thud. The barrier was down. The thud of the briefcase against the carpet was the final gavel bang, dismissing the case of us versus them. In the quiet that followed, the air didn't feel empty. It felt cleared, like the atmosphere after a lightning strike where the ozone hangs sharp and electric. I stepped into the space she had surrendered, closing that final, impossible distance. I reached out, my hand trembling just slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of the moment, and touched her cheek. Her skin was warm, fever-hot against my cool fingertips. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering shut, a long, shaky exhale escaping her lips that sounded like a dam breaking. It was a tactile mapping of the years we had spent apart, my thumb tracing the line of her jaw, rediscovering the geometry I had memorized a lifetime ago, but had been forbidden to touch. "Lydia," I whispered, the name no longer tasting like ash, but like oxygen. She opened her eyes, and the defiance was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded hunger. I leaned in. The kiss wasn't a collision of opposing forces. It was a resolution. It felt like a complex, unsolvable algorithm finally clicking into alignment, the variables balancing out into zero. It wasn't just physical. It was the feeling of relief, deep in the marrow. It was the sudden cessation of a noise I hadn't realized had been screaming in my head for 3 years. Her hands found my waist, gripping the fabric of my blouse with desperate strength, pulling me in until there was no air left between us, until the sharp buttons of her blazer pressed into my chest and the boundaries of our separate firms dissolved. We pulled apart slowly, just an inch, breath mingling in the space between our lips. Her forehead rested against mine, a heavy, grounding weight. "This is going to be a mess," she whispered, her voice rough, stripped of its polished legal cadence. "The firm, the board, the conflict of interest." "I know," I said, my hands sliding down to steady her shoulders. "It's a logistical nightmare. HR is going to have a field day." "I can't do the silence again," she admitted, pulling back enough to look me in the eye, the vulnerability stark on her face. I can't do the part where we stop talking because we're afraid of what we'll say. I can't treat us like a liability to be managed. Then we don't, I answered, the terms of the new deal forming clearly in my mind. We argue. We negotiate. We treat us like the most important client we have. We don't settle. And we don't draft exit clauses. She searched my face, looking for the catch, for the fine print. Finding none, a small, tired smile touched her lips. The first real one I'd seen in days. No exit clauses, she agreed. Strict performance metrics only. I laughed, a wet, breathless sound, and pulled her back into me, needing the sensory confirmation of her reality. I buried my face in the curve of her neck, inhaling the scent of sandalwood and rain, letting it overwrite the sterile smell of the office. I felt the solid weight of her against me, the steady, reassuring rhythm of her heart beating against my chest, syncing with mine. It was a different kind of power than the one we chased in the boardroom. Quieter, more dangerous, and infinitely more valuable. We stood there for a long time, two architects of a new reality, just breathing. Eventually, the world had to resume. We gathered her things, slowly this time. I picked up the briefcase, handing it to her not as a shield, but as luggage. We walked out of the office side by side, moving past the empty cubicles and the darkened conference rooms where we had waged war just hours before. We took the elevator down, the same steel box that had been a cage yesterday. Now, as the numbers descended, her hand found mine, her fingers lacing through mine with a grip that said she wasn't letting go. We walked out of the lobby doors, leaving the professional armor on the floor with the dust, stepping into the cool night air as partners, in every sense of the word. The storm had finally broken, leaving the night air crisp and cold. The city lights above us were no longer a blur of ambition, but sharp, crystalline points of navigation. I looked at Lydia, illuminated by the street lamps, and realized the truth I had been hiding from. The career was just the structure, the scaffolding of a life, but she was the home I had been trying to return to. If you've ever risked your heart in the place you least expected, subscribe to follow the journey.